The Supreme Court chamber was silent. Not the ordinary kind of silence. This was the kind that feels heavy. The kind that makes your heart beat a little faster even if you're just watching. The sound of shoes clicking on marble echoed through the vast room as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked toward the podium. Her navy blue suit stood out against the shining white marble walls. The cameras flashed like tiny lightning bolts, but she didn't flinch. A few moments earlier, one of the conservative justices had waved her off with a smirk and said, "Perhaps the Congresswoman should review basic constitutional principles before wasting the court's time." The words cut through the air like a knife. Reporters gasped. People whispered. But Jasmine didn't move. She just gripped the podium tighter and looked straight ahead. She had faced worse before. Growing up in the Arkansas Delta, fighting her way through law school, defending clients who couldn't afford to lose, it had all prepared her for this. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a politician. She was a fighter. Across the bench sat Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, calm but watchful. She didn't show much emotion, but her eyes followed every move Crockett made. The two women had never worked together, but they shared something deeper. Both had walked hard roads. Both had been underestimated. And both understood what it meant to fight for a seat at the table. This wasn't just another hearing. This was about voting rights, the foundation of American democracy. The law in question came from a southern state and would make voting harder for thousands of people, especially minorities. Supporters said it was about election security. Critics called it modern-day voter suppression. Crockett had been granted a rare opportunity to speak as an amicus curiae, a friend of the court. It was unusual for a congresswoman to appear before the Supreme Court. Many thought she was out of her depth. But those who knew her story understood. This was the kind of fight she was born for. The justices looked down from their high seats. The Chief Justice checked his watch. Justice Thomas leaned back. Justice Alito shuffled papers without looking up. Only Justices Jackson and Sotomayor seemed curious to hear what Crockett might say. Then the Chief Justice spoke. "Miss Crockett, you have 20 minutes. Jasmine nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. And may it please the court." Her voice was calm and firm. It carried across the marble chamber, strong enough to fill the space without shouting. "I stand before you today not just as a member of Congress, but as a lawyer who has seen firsthand the impact of laws like the one before you. Laws that take away the voice of the people who need it most." Before she could finish, Justice Alito interrupted sharply. "Congresswoman Crockett, we are not here for political speeches. Do you have any new legal arguments that haven't already been made?" The question was meant to throw her off. It was meant to make her look small. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. "Justice Alito," she said, her tone polite but steady. "I have legal arguments grounded in constitutional law and in the history of this very court. If I may continue, I'll show exactly why this law violates both." There was a pause, then silence again. She continued. Crockett began walking through data, clear, simple facts showing how similar laws in other states had cut minority voter participation by double digits. She explained how ID requirements, reduced polling hours, and voter purges all combined to make it harder for poor and minority communities to vote. The conservative justices exchanged looks. They hadn't expected numbers. They hadn't expected someone to come this prepared. Justice Thomas leaned forward. "These statistics may show differences, but they don't prove intent to discriminate." "And intent is what matters." Crockett nodded slowly. "Justice Thomas, if I may direct the court's attention to Exhibit C in our brief." She lifted a document. "These are internal emails between legislators in the state. They show conversations about targeting certain districts with high Black and Latino populations. The language is coded, but the intent is clear." A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Reporters started typing furiously. Justice Jackson leaned in slightly. Jasmine didn't stop. "We're not just talking about numbers. We're talking about patterns, decades of them. Each time the methods look different, but the goal is the same: silencing certain voters under the banner of integrity." Justice Barrett finally spoke. "Congresswoman, Prevention of fraud is hard to measure. The lack of fraud could mean existing measures work. Jasmine smiled politely. Justice Barrett, if we look at the evidence, states with strict laws and states without them show the same rate of voter fraud, nearly zero. So the claim of prevention doesn't stand. The gallery was quiet again. The atmosphere had shifted. Then Justice Gorsuch jumped in. Legislatures don't need absolute proof to act, Congresswoman. They can legislate based on potential risks. Crockett took a slow breath. She knew this moment would come. She glanced briefly toward Justice Jackson, who gave the faintest nod, barely noticeable. But enough. Justice Gorsuch, she said softly. This court ruled in Arlington Heights versus Metropolitan Housing that when a law burdens fundamental rights without clear justification, it's our duty to ask whether impermissible motives are at play. The Constitution doesn't allow fear to replace facts. That landed like a thunderclap. The conservative justice's expressions hardened. Justice Sotomayor's lips curled into the smallest hint of a smile. The Chief Justice straightened in his chair, perhaps realizing that this freshman congresswoman had just cited precedent better than half the lawyers who stood in that chamber. But the Chief Justice wasn't ready to let her continue. Your time is nearly over, Miss Crockett. Do you have anything new to add? The question dripped with condescension. Yes, Mr. Chief Justice, she replied, her voice unwavering. I do. She reached into her folder and pulled out a small leather-bound book. This, she said, is a record of the congressional debates from 1869, when the 15th Amendment was written. I'd like to share what the framers themselves said about laws like the one before us today. Even Justice Jackson looked intrigued. This was unexpected territory. The conservative majority prided itself on being originalists, interpreting the Constitution by its original meaning. But now Crockett was about to use their own philosophy against them. The authors of the 15th Amendment, she said, warned about states finding new ways to keep Black Americans from voting, ways that looked neutral on the surface but weren't in practice. The justices shifted in their seats. Justice Thomas frowned slightly. Justice Alito looked down at his notes. Crockett continued, quoting directly from the 1869 debates. One senator said, "If we do not write this carefully, states will deny the right to vote not because of race, but because of rules that target race indirectly." Her words echoed through the chamber. History shows us something simple, Crockett said. When lawmakers create barriers that they know will fall hardest on certain groups, they are not preserving democracy, they are redefining it for their own ends. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the Chief Justice hesitated. The marble walls seemed to hold the silence like breath. Justice Jackson's eyes locked on Crockett. She looked proud. She didn't smile, but her expression said everything. You've done it. You've reached them. The Chief Justice finally cleared his throat. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett. The court will... But before he could finish, Justice Jackson spoke for the first time. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and commanding. I would like to hear more about the historical record Congresswoman Crockett mentioned, she said. Gasps filled the room. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a justice to interrupt the chief. Crockett turned toward Justice Jackson. Of course, Your Honor. The debates show the framers fully understood that racial discrimination could hide behind neutral laws. They intended the 15th Amendment to reach those indirect barriers as well. Justice Jackson nodded slowly. Thank you, Congresswoman. The courtroom was frozen. Even the conservative justices stayed quiet. At that moment, everyone knew something extraordinary had happened. A congresswoman who wasn't even supposed to be taken seriously had just captured the attention and the respect of the Supreme Court's newest justice. Reporters would later describe that silence as electric. It was the sound of an old system shifting, even if just a little. Crockett gathered her notes and stepped back from the podium. The Chief Justice looked frustrated, but the balance in the room had changed. Justice Jackson still hadn't looked away. And deep down, everyone watching knew this was only the beginning. Because when two brilliant women, one on the bench and one at the podium, find themselves on the same side of history, The story isn't over. It's just getting started. That's what everyone in the chamber felt, even if no one dared say it aloud. The air was heavy with tension, like the moment right before a thunderstorm. Every eye was on Jasmine Crockett as she stepped away from the podium, her heart pounding, but her face calm and controlled. She had faced doubt, dismissal, and disrespect, but she had turned the moment around. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson still watched her with quiet intensity. Her gaze was steady, thoughtful, almost protective. It was rare to see such a connection in that room, a shared understanding between two women who had both fought their way to power through walls built to keep them out. Outside the courthouse, crowds held signs demanding fairness and equal access to the ballot box. Inside, you could almost feel history shifting. What had started as just another case about voting restrictions had now become a test of the Supreme Court's soul. Reporters whispered from the back rows. "She changed the mood," one said. Even Alito looked shaken. But the fight was far from over. The state's attorney, a gray-haired man with a crisp voice and a confident smirk, was preparing to deliver his rebuttal. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and rose to speak. But before he could take command of the room, Justice Jackson leaned forward again. "Counsel," she said, her tone perfectly even, "would you care to respond to Congresswoman Crockett's historical evidence regarding the 15th Amendment?" The man froze. He hadn't expected that question, not from her, not now. He hesitated, flipping through his papers. "Justice Jackson," he said finally, "I'm not familiar with those particular debates from 1869. Jackson nodded politely. Then she turned back toward Crockett. "Congresswoman, could you elaborate on how Senator William Stewart's statements inform our understanding of the 15th Amendment's purpose?" It was the lifeline Jasmine needed, the chance to drive her point home. "Of course, Your Honor," she said, stepping forward again. Senator Stewart, who helped draft the amendment, warned Congress that states might try to restrict voting rights in ways that appeared neutral, but were meant to suppress certain voters. He said the amendment's purpose was to stop exactly that. Her voice was calm, but her words hit like hammers. That means the amendment isn't just about preventing outright racial bans. It's about preventing disguised discrimination, laws written in clean language but stained with intent. The audience leaned in. Even the conservative justices, usually composed and distant, seemed unsettled. Justice Alito shuffled his papers again. Justice Thomas frowned. Justice Alito interrupted. "Congresswoman, one quote from history doesn't outweigh decades of legal precedent requiring proof of discriminatory intent." Jasmine's eyes met his. Her tone didn't change, but her resolve sharpened. "Justice Alito, I agree that precedent is vital. That's why I've used your own words from this court's decision in Brnovich v. Democratic National Committee to evaluate this law." The room froze. You could hear someone inhale sharply from the gallery. Quoting a sitting justice's own opinion against him was bold, dangerously bold. "In Brnovich," she continued, "you outlined 5 factors to consider when judging whether a voting law violates the Voting Rights Act." She lifted her hand and began counting on her fingers. First, the size of the burden. Second, how far the law departs from standard voting practices. Third, the disparate effect on minority voters. Fourth, the opportunities that remain to vote. And fifth, the strength of the state's justification. She looked directly at Alito. "This law fails on all 5 counts, by your own test." The tension in the chamber became almost unbearable. Justice Alito's face tightened, his jaw clenching. Justice Barrett's pen stopped moving. Justice Jackson looked down briefly, hiding a small but knowing smile. Every camera focused on Crockett. She had just done what no one thought possible. She had used the conservative majority's own framework to dismantle their argument. Justice Jackson spoke again, her voice measured but thoughtful. "Congresswoman, you've provided a thorough analysis. However, The state insists these provisions are race-neutral on their face. What evidence shows racial motivation? Jasmine nodded, grateful for the question. It was the opening she'd been waiting for, the chance to reveal the most powerful evidence she had. Justice Jackson, I refer the court to Appendix D of our brief, she said. It contains a confidential study conducted by the state legislature before the law was introduced. That study predicted which groups would be most affected by the restrictions. She held up the paper. According to that analysis, Black and Latino voters would be 3 times more likely to be impacted than white voters. And after seeing that data, the legislators didn't fix the problem, they made it worse. They strengthened the provisions that hit those groups hardest, and they removed sections that would have affected rural white voters. Gasps filled the chamber. Reporters scrambled to take notes. The Chief Justice frowned deeply. Justice Barrett looked genuinely surprised. Justice Jackson leaned back in her chair. Her voice softened slightly. Thank you, Congresswoman. That is very concerning evidence. It was rare praise, but in the Supreme Court, those words carried the weight of thunder. Justice Barrett, who had been silent for most of the morning, leaned forward now. Congresswoman Crockett, this analysis you reference, was it ever presented to the full legislature before they voted on the bill? Jasmine answered without hesitation. No, Your Honor. It was shared only with the bill's sponsors and senior leadership. And we have an email from the committee chair saying, quote, the racial data would create unnecessary complications if shared broadly. Barrett's expression changed. For the first time, she looked troubled. She wrote something quickly on her legal pad, then sat back, lost in thought. The Chief Justice, sensing the shift, tried to reassert control. Your time has expired, Miss Crockett, he said curtly. But everyone knew the damage was already done. Jasmine stepped back from the podium, her pulse steady, her face serene. She had done what she came to do. She hadn't just argued, she had educated. She had forced the court to look in the mirror. And then came the moment that would make headlines around the world. Justice Jackson looked directly at her and spoke clearly enough for everyone in the chamber to hear. The court appreciates arguments grounded in both original principles and modern precedent. When an advocate can bridge those worlds as effectively as you have today, it helps this court do its job better. Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett. The gallery erupted in whispers. The justices rarely praised advocates during oral arguments, almost never, in fact. For Justice Jackson to do so, and so publicly, meant something extraordinary had happened. Jasmine nodded respectfully and returned to her seat, but her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't nervous anymore, just filled with quiet adrenaline. She had come to make an argument, and she had made history instead. Across the room, Justice Barrett was still making notes. Justice Thomas sat silently, his face unreadable. The Chief Justice looked uneasy. And Justice Jackson? She was smiling now, only slightly, but for those who understood the court, that tiny smile said more than any opinion ever could. Outside, the world waited. Reporters were already typing feverishly, drafting headlines about a stunning performance and unexpected praise from the bench. Social media would soon explode. But inside the marble walls, something deeper was happening. The conversation had changed. The tone had changed. For years, the fight over voting rights had followed the same script. One side crying foul, the other claiming fraud. But on this day, Jasmine Crockett had introduced something new. Clarity. She didn't shout. She didn't posture. She simply showed the truth piece by piece until no one could ignore it. As the court adjourned for recess, the justices filed out in silence. Jackson was the last to leave. Before she stepped through the door, she turned back for a split second and caught Jasmine's eye. She gave the smallest nod as if to say, "You did it. That image. 2 women of color. One standing before the bench, one seated behind it. Both changing history in their own way, would be replayed on screens across America within hours." Outside the Supreme Court, the crowd cheered as Jasmine emerged into the sunlight. Microphones pushed forward. Cameras flashed. A reporter from BNN called out, "Congresswoman Crockett, how does it feel to stand toe-to-toe with the Supreme Court?" Jasmine smiled slightly. "Today wasn't about me," she said. "It was about every American whose right to vote is still being challenged. It was about making sure the Constitution means what it says, for everyone." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Older Americans watching from home would nod in agreement. They remembered the marches, the struggles, the decades of promises about equality. They could hear the sincerity in her voice. That night, every news channel ran the same footage. Commentators debated what had happened. Some called it a legal masterclass. Others called it a political earthquake. But no one could deny it. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had changed the story. On social media, clips of her exchange with Justice Jackson went viral. The hashtag #YouMeCrockettConstitution trended nationwide. People who had never watched a Supreme Court hearing before were now sharing quotes, cheering her composure and replaying the moment Justice Jackson said, "Thank you, Congresswoman." In law schools, professors told students to rewatch her arguments. "That," one professor said, "is how you make the law come alive." And in homes across America, ordinary people who had grown tired of politics felt something rare: hope. Because what they saw that day wasn't just another hearing or another partisan fight. It was the story of courage meeting opportunity. It was proof that the right person, in the right place, at the right moment, could still move mountains. But even as Jasmine celebrated quietly with her small team that night, she knew the battle wasn't over. The court's decision would come weeks later, and in those weeks, powerful forces would try to twist the narrative, discredit her, and pressure the justices. Still, something inside her told her the tide had turned. She had seen it in Justice Jackson's eyes. The spark had been lit, and soon, the entire nation would see what that spark would ignite. Because sometimes, one voice in one room can change everything, and the next chapter of that change was only days away. The morning after the hearing, the entire country was talking about Jasmine Crockett. Every news network replayed the moment Justice Jackson praised her arguments. Every headline carried her name. Congresswoman shakes the Supreme Court. Crockett challenges the court's majority. Justice Jackson's unexpected words. For many Americans, it was the first time they had seen a congressional representative stand before the highest court and speak with such calm authority. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't begged for attention. She had simply spoken truth, with the clarity and confidence of someone who knew the law and believed in it. In Washington, reporters gathered outside her office. Producers called nonstop requesting interviews. Law students and young attorneys sent messages of admiration. But Jasmine stayed quiet. She wasn't interested in fame. She was waiting for something bigger, the decision itself. Inside the Supreme Court building, the justices met behind closed doors for their traditional post-argument conference. No cameras. No reporters. Just 9 people in a private room deciding the future of voting rights in America. According to later reports from insiders, that meeting was unlike any other. Justice Jackson led the discussion, methodically walking through the evidence Crockett had presented. She pointed to the original congressional debates from 1869. She asked her colleagues to explain how they could call themselves originalists while ignoring the original words of the 15th Amendment's authors. Justice Barrett listened quietly, reviewing her notes. The other conservatives exchanged uneasy glances. The Chief Justice cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. At one point, Justice Jackson said, "If we truly believe in the original meaning of the Constitution, then we must accept that those who wrote it understood that discrimination doesn't always announce itself by name." That sentence, according to one clerk, hung in the air like thunder. For the first time in years, the lines between the court's ideological wings seemed blurred. Barrett looked unsettled. Kavanaugh leaned back, thoughtful. Even Chief Justice Roberts seemed less certain than before. When the meeting ended, there was no immediate vote. The justices wanted to think. That was unusual. Normally, preliminary votes happen right after arguments. But this time, no one wanted to rush. Crockett's performance had shaken the usual rhythm of the court. Meanwhile, outside those marble walls, America was alive with conversation. On social media, older viewers who had watched the hearing live were sharing clips with captions like, "She made them listen." Younger viewers were discovering her for the first time. Calling her a hero for democracy, talk shows debated what her argument might mean. Legal analysts on CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News couldn't stop discussing it. One former federal judge said, "In 30 years of court watching, I've never seen a moment like that." Even critics admitted she had done something remarkable. By using the conservative justices' own logic against them, she had created a dilemma no one could easily escape. To rule against her arguments now would mean rejecting the very principles they claimed to uphold. 3 days later, the New York Times published a front-page story titled "The Crockett-Jackson Connection." The article described the quiet alliance between the Congresswoman and the justice, the unspoken understanding between two women who had lived through the same struggles and now found themselves in positions to shape history. In one paragraph, a court insider was quoted as saying, "Justice Jackson had been waiting for a case like this, something that allowed her to merge history, fairness, and constitutional law into one clear argument." Crockett gave her that chance. At the same time, conservative media fought back. Some commentators claimed Justice Jackson had crossed a line by praising Crockett during oral arguments. They said it was unprofessional, but their outrage only fueled the public's curiosity. The story was everywhere. On TikTok, short clips of Crockett's calm response to Justice Alito's interruptions went viral. On Facebook, older voters, many in their 50s and 60s, shared posts praising her poise. "She reminded me of when leaders had backbone," one user wrote. "She didn't shout. She just spoke truth." A week later, Jasmine finally broke her silence in a brief press conference. Standing outside the Capitol, she said, "This case isn't about politics. It's about people, their right to vote, their right to be heard, and their right to belong in the democracy they helped build." The crowd applauded. Her words were simple but powerful. They cut through all the noise. In classrooms and law schools, professors began using her hearing as a teaching moment. "Notice how she used evidence, not emotion," one instructor told his students. "She didn't just argue. She built a bridge between history and today." Even Hollywood took notice. A well-known documentary filmmaker announced plans to create a special about the case, calling it "The Day the Court Listened." Weeks passed. The country waited. Then, on a bright Thursday morning, the Supreme Court released its decision. The ruling was 5-4. For the first time in years, the conservative majority had split. Justice Amy Coney Barrett joined the court's liberal justices and Justice Jackson in striking down the state's restrictive voting law. The opinion, written by Justice Jackson herself, cited Congresswoman Crockett's arguments several times by name. It even quoted the same 1869 congressional debate Crockett had read aloud in the courtroom. When the framers of the 15th Amendment prohibited denial or abridgment of the right to vote on account of race, the opinion said, they understood that discrimination could take subtle forms. The Constitution forbids not only explicit barriers, but also those crafted to achieve the same result by other means. Those words made history. Justice Alito, furious, wrote a sharp dissent accusing the majority of reshaping precedent. But even his anger couldn't overshadow what had just happened. Jasmine Crockett's arguments had not only changed minds, they had changed the law. That afternoon, crowds gathered outside the Supreme Court again, this time in celebration. Strangers hugged each other. People held signs reading, "Our voices count" and "Democracy wins." Reporters surrounded Jasmine as she exited the building. She smiled and said softly, "This is not my victory. It's America's." Inside her office later that evening, she received a small envelope delivered by hand. The return address was the Supreme Court. Inside was a handwritten note. It was from Justice Jackson. "Thank you," it read. Your clarity and courage reminded this court why we serve." Jasmine sat in silence for a long time, holding the note. She framed it and hung it on her wall the next morning. The ruling had immediate impact. Several states announced they would pause enforcement of similar voting laws. Civil rights groups prepared new challenges using the Jasmine Crockett precedent as their foundation. News outlets called it a new era in voting rights. For millions of Americans, the decision meant something deeply personal. It meant their vote mattered again. It meant the system had listened, at least for one moment, to the people who had been ignored for too long. Political analysts described the Crockett-Jackson moment as the most significant shift in voting rights jurisprudence in a generation. But for everyday Americans, it was simpler. It was hope. Weeks later, President Biden invited both women to the White House for a private meeting. Officially, it was about policy discussions, but everyone knew it was also a quiet celebration. Two women who had changed the course of history sat across from each other, not as politician and justice, but as equals. After the meeting, cameras caught them shaking hands on the White House lawn. It was a moment that captured hearts across the nation. Law schools began adding Crockett versus State Election Commission to their constitutional law syllabi. Professors called it a modern-day Brown v. Board for the right to vote. And in communities that had long felt left out of democracy, the decision sparked a wave of new energy. Voter registration drives grew. Turnout in local elections rose. For the first time in years, people felt like their voices truly counted again. When reporters asked Jasmine what she thought of the comparison to Brown versus Board, she smiled modestly and said, "I'm just grateful that the truth still matters. That words can still move mountains." Her humility only made people admire her more. Justice Jackson, meanwhile, became a central figure in the court's new chapter. Her majority opinion in the Crockett case became one of the most cited rulings in the following years. She often referred to it not as her own success, but as an example of what happens when history and courage meet in the same room. Months after the decision, a documentary titled Voices of the Constitution premiered on national television. It told the full story, how a freshman congresswoman stood before the Supreme Court, faced skepticism, and left with a victory that changed America. In one of the final scenes, Jasmine's voice narrated softly over images of the courtroom, "Democracy isn't perfect. It stumbles. It forgets. But every once in a while someone stands up and reminds it who it's supposed to be." That quote spread everywhere. Schools printed it on posters. Activists painted it on signs. And for many Americans, it became a simple reminder that courage doesn't always roar. It sometimes just speaks clearly and refuses to back down. The legacy of that day lived on, not just in law books, but in the hearts of millions who saw what was possible when someone refused to be silenced. Even years later, people still talk about that hearing. The look on Justice Jackson's face, the silence after Crockett's final words, the moment the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. They talk about how one voice, steady, calm, unshaken, can echo louder than anger. They talk about how respect, once earned, can change even the hardest minds. And they remember the image that started it all. A young congresswoman standing at a podium, gripping the edges, staring down the most powerful court in the country, and daring to remind them of the promise written in the Constitution. That promise, of equality, of fairness, of the right to be heard, wasn't just law. It was life. As Jasmine Crockett once said in an interview years later, "I didn't go to the Supreme Court to win an argument. I went to tell the truth, and sometimes the truth wins all by itself." The interviewer asked if she ever expected that moment to become history. She smiled softly. "No," she said. "I just hoped they'd listen." And they did. Because when the truth is spoken with courage, even marble walls have to listen. And that is how one woman, one voice, and one unforgettable moment helped restore faith in the very foundation of American democracy. If you found this story powerful, remember to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next deep look into the real stories shaping our nation. Stay stay inspired, stay informed, and never stop believing that one voice, your voice, can still make history.